You're listening to the Perth Property Show, Australia's only weekly property podcast by West Australian experts for West Australian listeners. Catch your latest episode every Monday at 7 a.m.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Perth Property Show. My name's Trent Fleskens, your host as always, and we're very lucky to have Tim Reardon, Chief Economist from the HIA, back in the studio. He's one of our guests who has been highly requested to come back in the studio. A number of people have spoken about how much they enjoyed his last episode, talking essentially about where the market was at the time. I believe that was last year. And so under huge fanfare, you're back in the studio, Tim, and a big thank you for giving up your precious time as you pop in for a few days into lovely Western Australia.
Indeed, thank you for the lovely warm weather, and yes, first time back since November.
I can't believe it's already been 6 months since our last chat, but it's very much a conversation that I think we need to continue to have, because what you are so valued on this podcast for having is context. Now, we're pretty confident in Perth that we know our market. We know the ins and outs, the nuances of what makes the suburbs, the councils tick, the planning side. But it's really important for us to step back sometimes and get a holistic view of, hey, how are we going compared to the rest of the states, especially when we're all supposed to be on some common goal right now of building enough homes to house all the people we have. And being the Chief Economist of the HIA, I think that's a very poignant point. Now, I wanted to start this conversation with reading out a small paragraph from the latest HIA WA outlook. It is fresh off the press, right? Autumn 2024.
Released just last Wednesday, Trent.
Perfect. So this absolutely jumped out of the page. Now, this report is 37 pages long, but this one paragraph says it all for me. Coming from the HIA, from your mouth, and you don't hold any punches here, you say, without meaningful reform, which appears unlikely in the current context, to taxation, investment policy, and land supply, the sector will fall short of delivering the homes Australia needs. Affordability will worsen, supply will remain constrained, and the housing shortage will deepen over the rest of the decade and beyond. That is about as damning as you could say as a chief economist who, to be frank, has to have good relationships with the state governments, don't you?
Yes, and I think we have a very good relationship with our West Australian government and with all of them. But as we've come through that last federal election where housing was the key issue, we know that in 3 years' time when we go to the next election that it is going to get worse. There is very little that can be done in such a short time frame as 3 years. When we look at the detached market, yes, falling interest rates will see home building activity pick up, likely to see home building pick up through until at least 2028. And then on the multi-unit side of the market, which is where things are really constrained, Sydney, Melbourne and Brisbane starting half the volume of apartments, Perth around about a third the volume of apartments it was a decade ago, and that's a critical concern because we know now that we're going to go 3 years with a very low volume of apartment completions, which means that imbalance between supply and demand gets worse over the course of the next 3 years.
Speaking to Mike McGowan, your executive director, and only, I think 3 weeks ago, he made it very clear as well that we don't expect to be meeting our goals this decade and that we are at capacity.
What we've done in this outlook is we've really been looking more long-term over the course of the next 5 to 10 years. So we looked at 2030 and 2035 as markers. And when we look at Perth, at no stage in the course of the next 5 years does home supply rise sufficiently to meet demand. Now, within that, of course, we're expecting our national economy to keep growing, global economy to remain relatively stable, and the West Australian economy to continue to grow. I don't think there's any surprise in that. The Australian economy is incredibly robust and resilient. And so within that framework, ongoing population growth, ongoing economic growth, Western Australia should be completing around about 30,000 homes per year. It needs to be in order to meet demand. Your demand for housing is about 30,000. Now, you're completing less than 20,000 last year. Now, we're going to see detached home building grow another 20%. It's already 50 to 80% higher than what it was just prior to the pandemic. So enormous growth there. Now, it's hit its capacity constraint. It's been at a capacity constraint, particularly due to labour, for the last 5 years. And as a consequence, we're only going to see detached home building grow depending on labour constraints. And then the apartment side of the market, there are very few apartments starting here.
The apartments have to be the growth sector, right? They have to be picking up the slack, not only in the next couple of years, but forever going forward.
Yeah. And so you're starting a couple of thousand. You should be starting 10,000. And even in 5 years, we're expecting very significant growth in apartments, but only getting you to half the volume that you need to be commencing.
Yeah, so when you start at 2,000 and then you do 3,000 next year, we've grown 50%.
Exactly. And
but we're still not even hitting the sides.
No. And then, so what will happen in this cycle, demand continues to rise faster than supply. House prices will continue to grow. Add into that the cyclical factors of a decline in interest rates. So now Perth's rapid house price growth growth, you guys have caught up on house prices now. You're just 10% less than Brisbane. That's your natural order of things. But now we have national house prices growing because interest rates are falling. So now Perth catches that national wave. You're on the rising tide of the national economy again for the first time, maybe in 10, 15 years.
It feels like the only time we've been not counter-cyclical to the East Coast.
That's right. Welcome to a national economy.
Yeah. So I don't know if we like that as a chip on the shoulder, West Australians as we are, but it seems to be the reality and stark reality if you are not in the home ownership space or just a spectator, but one that people are in a biased way possibly comforted by if you own property, because it just doesn't seem like there are any people arguing that housing prices will drop like Christopher Joy was a few years ago, which made him look really silly, or any arguments to be argued that house prices could drop, because, however, there continues to be a sustained and if not mounting argument of data and logic that this is just going to be the world order for us in Perth, let alone the rest of the country, that we aren't meeting our supply targets. We can't meet our supply targets. Interest rates are going to keep dropping for a while. Therefore, there's no reason why prices won't keep going up unless there is some catastrophic black swan event that corrects the capitalist world order we sit in right now.
Yeah, so just ignoring that black swan event, our expectations are a cyclical rate cut now, but because of very rapid population growth, which is likely to be sustained over the next 5 years, higher levels of government expenditure over the next 5 years, the cash rate won't fall back to pre-pandemic. And so that will start constraining home building from around about 2028 onwards, whether that particularly detached side of the market.
And prices as well, because we've hit it in Perth recently where we noted that some suburbs in Perth were hitting some affordability caps. No demand was continually pushing us up to that ceiling. At some point in time, as rates drop, prices keep going up. Eventually, you hit that ceiling again. Let's call it 20% more, don't you?
No, there is no such thing as a house price ceiling or rental price ceiling. I hear economists say that people can't afford a further increase, and they can't. They don't want to. But if there is only one home in the country, then Gina Reinhardt will buy that house, and she will pay $1 more for it than the second wealthiest Australian. And so rental price growth, house price growth, if supply fails to meet demand, then prices will continue. That is a basic economic principle.
That's Sydney, right?
Yes.
They make slightly less than us, but their prices are double what ours are.
And then what you get is times, because of the way the data is collected and structured, you do get pauses in the data. And when I was here in November, we're talking about that's going to happen to Perth at some stage, probably 18 months away.
There was a pause.
And it will come. You will see a short period of house price where the data collectors on house prices will say prices in Perth are falling, maybe just a couple of percent. But it is not that those people are selling houses on a falling market. It is just the way the data is collected and the way transactions happen through periods of time when there's a little bit of confidence there that it will just come off a little bit. But it is not a fundamental change that there is an adequate supply in Perth.
That's pretty resounding, the things you're saying here. And we could go into a lot more depth into your report, but we'll come to the same conclusion at the end of the day. We can talk about more statistics. We can talk to graphs that I'm looking at right now. Even the HIA's forecast, which I'd like to think would be ever optimistic because you represent an industry that wants to be growing. Your forecasts don't even come close to the number of quarterly starts that we would need to get to that 30,000 a year, all the way through to the end of the decade. That's a poignant point, isn't it? As an economist, you've said it. That's something that I guess the next question has to be. Firstly, I'd like to ask a alternate reality question. Would this be any different under, let's say, a Liberal government who was suggesting that they were going to severely limit immigration? Would that have been one of the policies that would help us get to some equilibrium?
Yeah, look, I don't think there's any doubt that population is at the core of that. There are only two things that determine demand for housing, and that is population growth and the average number of people per home. And I think the more interesting political aspect is that both political parties turned up to the last federal election with policies to invest in infrastructure. And that is the key. That is the long-term cause of this underlying national undersupply of housing. And we talk about in the context of the problem is who pays to make water flow uphill. And if we can resolve who pays to make water flow uphill, then we will resolve the housing shortage problem. And so by that, the cost of building infrastructure, water, sewage, road, transport, at some stage you have to make water flow uphill, and it's really expensive. And if we go back and look at what happened in the 1980s, 100% of the cost of that infrastructure was paid for by the state government, the Department of Main Works, or whichever department it was in respective states. In the 1990s, we moved to a user pays model. By the year 2000, it was 100% user pays, and And from then on, things got significantly worse. And if we go to Sydney, in Sydney at the moment, not only does the person moving into a home for the first time have to pay for 100% of the cost of the infrastructure, they also have to pay for 100% of the cost of the upgrade for trunk infrastructure for downstream users, which includes roads, rail, sewage, water treatment, likes. And then on top of that, they also have to pay for the maintenance of that infrastructure in perpetuity up front.
Are you suggesting we should count ourselves lucky here in Perth?
Indeed, you are, in terms of the context of what those constraints. Now, from a market perspective, what we're seeing in Perth, you guys have at the moment the fastest increase in land prices. Maybe a little bit of catch up there, but from a state perspective, you had an affordability benefit. South Australia and Perth in particular were drawing workers over the past 5 years out of Sydney and Melbourne that were forcing people out that couldn't afford to live there. Quality of life. Now, Perth is going to lose that inherent advantage as you catch up to Brisbane, and that's unfortunate. So you're not going to see that.
The value proposition diminishes as our house prices and our rents increase, is what you're saying.
That's right, and we can see it's still carrying on in Adelaide at the moment. South Australian market is second strongest in the country behind Perth at the moment, and there is a real change in the demographics of South Australia has been losing people really since the late 1980s to Melbourne, and now they're just clawing. It's not strong, but the interstate migration out of Melbourne back to Adelaide is positive, and that leads to a change in the demographic of people building houses there, and they're looking at around 10 to 20% increased home building activity compared to what it was pre-pandemic. Now, of course, in Adelaide, we're not comparing a like and a like. Pre-pandemic, they lost Mitsubishi and Holden, and on the other side of the pandemic, they have increased infrastructure investment in electricity and in military investment, and so a change in the nature of their economy too. More reliance on government investment means more stable households, and we talk also about unicorn cities, Townsville, Wagga, Newcastle, cities that have both a large hospital, university and military base. They have very stable home building levels of activity because when you go through economic contractions, one member of the household will lose their job, but you don't lose the population because one person still has. You're able to service your mortgage, so you don't exit out of Perth and Adelaide and shift to Melbourne. You remain stable. And so we're seeing a structural shift in Adelaide, which is a positive.
Is it as much of a pull to Adelaide as it is a push from Melbourne? I mean, from Perth, Melbourne looks like a stinker of a place to be at the moment.
Yeah, I think it's easiest to see in Sydney. 1,000 to 1,500 people a month are leaving Sydney and moving to the Gold Coast. So the exit out of Melbourne was very strong during the pandemic, and they flowed to regional Victoria, Queensland and to South Australia. And from what we can see at the moment, there is a small tick of workers coming back into Adelaide. It's not as strong as the net interstate migration that we have in Perth, and that's Perth still has higher wages than the rest of the country. It's still absorbing construction workers and mining workers as quick as it can from anywhere else in the country. For the relative change for South Australia is that they've gone from losing people every month to gaining.
So if we can get political and go back to what you were just speaking about before, the industry will know it as developer contributions here in Perth. We've referenced this on the podcast before, and it's that reality that back in the day, let's call it pre-80s, the state government paid for urban expansion.
Yep.
All the infrastructure stuff that you spoke about, the pushing water uphill. And since then, they've had a bit of a sleight of hand policy that's grown and probably just copied what they were doing on the East Coast, as you're referencing, where they started to say, we're going to charge the developer contributions for the roads, for the water. They're going to have to pay a tax per hectare or per lot to pay for all these things in a cost-sharing arrangement with each other, instead of the state government having already provided them first. Right?
Yeah, that's right.
Now, what we do know, actually, is that every free market, if the state government, through any tax, passes that on to a business, to stay viable, that business is just going to pass it on to the end user. And the critical thing here, I think, that's becoming very obvious to me in these conversations, when we think about the shift of wealth from young people to older people around the world, but specifically related to Australia and Perth, is that back in the day when 60, 70, 80-year-old people now are buying their first home, they were not being burdened by these taxes, which we say makes up about 40% of the cost of our land, which is why things were so much cheaper back then.
That's right.
And obviously mortgages were cheaper, they were quicker to pay off. Rents were therefore cheaper because it was cheaper to build new housing. And then you look at their grandchildren now, those people are paying right now at $400 and something thousand for 400 square metres, 40 k's from the city. And they're expected to build a house on that and then pay that off over a lifetime. Now, that puts them far back, like a stall gift nearly, 130 metres to do it, whereas the rest of our grandparents were running 80 metres to get to the same finish line. That seems to be a very obvious, demonstrable example of how cost of living has been shifted to the next generation in Western Australia. It's a sleight of hand by government, in my opinion.
Yeah, that's right. And as you make something more expensive, you get less of it. So now that people building a new home are not just paying for 100% of the infrastructure, they're taxed on top of that as well, and they're subsidising other households through building a new home, then we end up in this scenario nationally of having an acute shortage of housing stock. Now, in the federal election campaign, it was positive to see both major political parties with infrastructure policies, 5 billion here and 10 billion there. And that's wonderful because that goes to the core of the problem. The federal government taking over responsibility for building the infrastructure to make water flow uphill will, in the long run, begin to address those fundamental infrastructure problems we have of bringing sufficient land to market to build enough homes.
When do you think we see the outcomes of that?
At its best, it's 10 years away from having an impact on price, and that's because of the time frame it takes to build and bring land to market, as you're well aware. Now, one of the catches to that is that in the Federal Labor Party's policy that they brought to market, they tied the gifting of that funding that they provide into state governments to a requirement to have a minimum volume of sales to first home buyers of those developments. And that's a problem, to gift on one hand and then on the other side to then start taxing and adding restrictions. We've been through this in just about every other iteration of housing policy where governments attempt to do this.
10% affordable housing, 20% social housing.
Inclusionary zoning is the term, the catch-all term for that, where
nothing ever happens at the end of the day.
Exactly, where you provide a tax concession on one front and then you tax on the other and nothing happens. And that's the risk that we have. If the federal government is going to intervene and increase the supply of infrastructure, don't tie it to achieving. The goal should be to increase the supply of housing by lowering the cost. And yes, we need more public housing stock. But in order to build more public housing stock, we need to tax the general public, not just those that are building new homes.
On the frontier.
That's right. And we saw it also, the federal government legislation last year, the Labor Party brought build-to-rent legislation where they were going to provide particularly Australian superannuation companies with a tax concession to build-to-rent projects, which is great. More homes is good. But by the time it came out of Parliament, they'd added another tax into it in order to subsidise affordable housing for essential workers in those dwellings, meaning that if you were renting in one of these build-to-rent apartments, you were taxed an additional amount to provide subsidised housing for others. Now, that we need more subsidised housing, but it should be paid for by the public.
The broader community. Yeah.
Not just a narrow cohort. And so that, it just goes once again to the core of the problem. Stop using new homes as the main form of taxation.
That is a fantastic soundbite right there. Stop using new homes as your main form of taxation, because all you do is make young people poor.
Yes, and it leads to all of the inequities that we're seeing at the moment. And it is really unfortunate politically and economically how things transpire over the course of the next 3 years.
So do you suggest, or is it just a reality, that the government entity that should be responsible for paying for the cost of infrastructure for the supply of new housing should be the federal government? Should it be the state governments? Should it be developers to an extent, knowing that it will get passed through? Who should pay for public assets at the end of the day?
Well, let's agree that the people moving into a house shouldn't be paying more than 100% of the cost of the infrastructure, as they are just about everywhere. But I will say that South Australia has probably cracked the model more than anywhere else. And they're looking at a third paid for out of consolidated revenue, a third paid for through existing water users, and a third paid for by the developer, or in effect the first household.
So let's make that more clear. So through consolidated revenue, that's the state government paying some amount. Through existing users, that's everyone else's water rates going up. Yep. And then the other third is through developer contributions passed on to the new landowner.
Yes.
See, that seems more equitable to me.
Seems sustainable too.
If I'm a grandparent living in Wembley, and because of the situation with housing, my grandchild or even my child can't live anywhere near me, and therefore they're living out in the back of Wanneroo, should we all be exempt from the cost of growing our city to house our next generation? I don't think the answer is yes. I think as a population, if we're going to be complicit in growth of our population, we need to be responsible for the cost of providing housing to that population, not just passing it on to what is really the most underrepresented politically, people who have emigrated here from a different country.
Yes.
So different cultures, or young people who still don't really know what a mortgage is.
Yeah, you can't have demand unconstrained and then constrained supply. Now, whether it is the federal government paying for that third of the infrastructure Revision or the state government. I'm going to leave that to the horizontal fiscal equalisation policies and the GST and so forth, and step out of having that debate. I don't mind which one it is. I think that if you were to look at it from a national perspective, yes, fundamental tax reform that was skipped over with the Henry Tax Review. Had we have completed that process and restructured how state governments gained revenue, we wouldn't have seen them. In the case of Victoria, half of their revenue comes from taxes on homes, and in the past 12 months we've seen additional taxes increased on stamp duty and on ownership of a second home. In the case of New South Wales, they've also, and Queensland, have both increased stamp duty rates as well. Continuing to have that cycle where their main form of revenue
on property development.
Yeah, so it's alcohol, tobacco and homes are the three undesirable things that governments are taxing out of existence, yes.
Yeah, but isn't it funny that alcohol, tobacco, you can suggest, yeah, we want less of that consumption, but home consumption is the thing that the government is addicted to because that's where they get their money.
So short of fundamental tax reform in Australia, and we'll put that one aside, federal government intervention to fund infrastructure is a welcome move, but don't tie it to achieving a certain cohort of first home buyers or public housing or affordable housing. Yes, we need more of that. And the federal government's own policy of building 30 to 50,000 public houses is great, but no amount of public housing stock is going to solve this housing shortage. Only 2 to 3% of homes built in Australia are public homes. It is the other 97%, the private home ownership, that we need to grow. And for example, hypothetically, let's say new public house costs $1 million, house and land package around about $1 million. Providing $50,000 to a private home will get one home built. So the government gets a far better return on investing in infrastructure to lower the cost of home building than they do out of building public housing stock. And given how significant the problem is and will be over the next 3 years, they're going to get a better return on their investment by unconstraining costs than they are on building public housing stock.
That's a really good point.
But it shouldn't be one or the other.
That's right. It needs to be part of the mix. And
Yes.
in Western Australia, I think most people applaud John Kerry, the Minister for Housing and Planning, his program, which to be frank has been a very expensive program given house costs now compared to what they were 10 years ago before he was in the portfolio, nothing he can control, to have a continual pipeline of state housing, public housing, as you would say. And most of us believe that's something that should be continued into perpetuity. The state government should be a developer of public housing where market failure exists, both in the regions and in the city. Another thing that's in your report that's also quite poignant is your observations of just how many people in Western Australia, given the cost and lack of trust in new home building, have turned to renovation.
Yeah, so we're on a little bit of a national rise here. So every jurisdiction, we're seeing a shift towards increasing renovation. It's not a surprise. As land prices rise, as house prices rise, there's two things happen. There's the positive wealth effect. People feel wealthier. They can go back to their bank, borrow more money to undertake a renovation, but increasingly make the decision to renovate rather than relocate.
Is it like upcycling furniture?
Yeah, yes. And as your family grows, it doesn't affect sea changers and retirees. They're downsizing and they still need to relocate. But for those with a growing family, they will increasingly make the decision to make their home larger, to renovate, than they will to relocate. And that's partly because of the constraint on supply, but also with what they can get for their return on their investment. And so we can see Western Australia now around about 40% more expenditure on renovations this year than what it was 12 months ago.
Is that because they're doing 40% more renovating or because the cost of renovating is going up?
Little column A.
Yeah.
Little column B. And that trend is likely to continue both in terms of costs and in terms of increased renovation activity, mostly because of the rise in land prices. 30% increase in cost of land over the last 12 to 18 months in Perth. That is what's going to be the driving force for increasing renovation activity.
I think renovation is the fallback for most people's decisioning. I think if people had the choice, they would just simply forego the stuff around, move down the road to the house they'd rather be in or down the road to the estate they'd rather be in, but then go through that discovery process of realising they are losing the battle at the negotiation table or they can't afford, and then they look back at what they've already got, they like their location, they just have outgrown their house and go, you know what, let's just build up.
And tens of thousands of dollars in stamp duty get you a long way into a renovation.
That's a good point. That's a kitchen and a bathroom, isn't it?
Yeah. So people do make that decision. And that cycle, in WA too, there's another thing occurring, which is historically around about a third of every home building market is people engaged on the renovation side, and 2/3 of those building new, and by that are subcontractors that are genuinely undertaking the building work. Now, indeed, that's gotten skewed over the past few years, and the majority of your labour force has been focused on building new. And what we're seeing now is a recalibration to more long-term and sustainable share of that market. So just a number of those workers now shifting back to renovation side. Now, from an individual builder perspective, which is something we've skipped over here, strong population growth, strong demand for homes is seeing it's a good time to be a home builder in Perth. Yes, you have challenges, but it's much better to be challenged by not being able to find sufficient labour than it is to be able to not find sufficient customers. And the renovation side of the market, Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, is extraordinarily strong. Prices are also very good from a margin and builder perspective. Those that are focused, high-end, high-value, custom renovation work is a good business to be in at the moment.
Oh, renovation margins, I would have thought would be off the charts right now for small builders compared to even what I think would be a pretty healthy profit right now for builders just in the new home space. I would love to be a renovator right now. I'd assume my margins are 30, 40, 50%.
For certainly someone leaving school and looking at a career in the skilled trades is certainly becoming increasingly lucrative, yes.
You told me off air that Perth is currently building more properties than Sydney.
Perth is currently building more detached houses than Sydney, and it is an extraordinary scenario. So when the state government doesn't plan to build many homes, it's unsurprising that they don't build very many homes. And so that's why a new house and land package Western Sydney, at least an hour from the city on public transport, is 1.6 million compared to here where you're 850 probably, by the time, and you have that discussion of how do we see the volume of home building in Sydney pick up, and the answer is you have to take $600,000 off the price of land, and that is the solution to the housing shortage in Sydney. And the only way to do that is to shift the taxes off those that are building the new home and for them to shift into consolidated revenue.
It costs about the same to build the house though, doesn't it?
Yeah, the home building is very similar. So your Perth is double brick and single story, and Sydney is smaller with 2 stories, but the net outcome is the average build contract are almost identical across the country.
Yeah, so this is where it's mental, right? Paying about $400 to $450 for our build. You're saying they're paying about $400 to $450, maybe
about
$450. Yep, great. So we're paying $400,000 for our land. You're saying they're paying $1.2 million for their land.
Yeah, just a bit over $1 million for less than a 500 square metre block in a location that's more than an hour on public transport to the city.
Anyone in Western Australia who is complaining about the cost of their house out in Henley Brook, out in Piara Waters, out in Alkimos, suck it up. What is going on in Sydney?
It is that supply of land, and it is the taxes that are built into it. It's paying to make water flow uphill.
Yeah.
And it is long-term structural. Every decision that has been made is about piling costs into development. Those fees all end up being paid for by a household at the end.
One thing that's been lagging in Perth is the used apartment space. People still haven't really glommed on to the benefits of apartments. I think it's because not as many people have been exposed to going to a mate's house or a child's house who live in one, and so you fear what you don't know. And therefore our second-hand apartment market is cheaper, and therefore you could buy 2 second-hand apartments in Perth than one 500 square metre block of land in nowhere Sydney.
Yeah.
What's going on there compared to what's happening in the East Coast?
The apartment market on the East Coast has also seen the rise in the cost of construction, both materials and labour, and the volume of apartments there is around half of what they were a decade ago. And the key to that is, in addition to those rising costs, they've forced foreign capital. State governments have taxed foreign capital, which is the worst own goal housing policy.
So stupid.
They allow,
That's where the money comes from to do these apartments. Where do you think it's coming from, people? It's coming from Southeast Asians who are used to building these things.
Yes, so allowing in international students, but not allowing the money that goes to build the homes that they want to live in.
Yeah.
It's a very strange policy, but the worst component of it is it's not taxing individuals looking to build a new apartment. It is the institutions taxing foreign banks, foreign institutions that never come here, but are responsible for building apartments all the way around the world, and then not allowing them to build in Australia is a very bizarre scenario.
Yeah, and that's what's leading to where we're at.
Yeah. In terms of the apartment cycle here in Perth, yes, established apartments are going to need to rise in price, and that will happen. They
are rising, but they're nowhere near the East Coast.
It's just a matter of time. And the cost of building here apartments has gone up, and national construction code's a component to that as well. But eventually, established prices will rise. They will meet the price of building new, and then we get a cycle of investment in apartments in Perth. And so, yes, our expectation is that we see modest growth in apartments over the course of next 3 years in Perth before they gradually accelerate. And by 2030, a third of homes in Western Australia will be apartments.
So you're suggesting we're going to find the builders over the next 5 years?
We will create them. They will either relocate from East Coast or they will develop locally. It has to come. At some stage, Perth is going to need more apartments.
Yeah, we already need them. It's just that at the moment we continue to go with the panacea of building out East Wanneroo past Lake Meridian, Lake Jandabup, going south of Byford into Mundajong and places that a lot of people never would have thought would have been urban, screwing up our freeways. Now, for me, I struggle to see where we're going to have that big push, not only from the population to demand apartments, given the price parity for the most part that it's already receiving, and we just can't get our head around paying the same for an apartment as 400 square metres 50 kilometres away. But also the industry wanting the hassle. It is such a pain in the ass to do infield in Western Australia, and I understand it's probably twice as bad in the East Coast. But the difference is that it's juxtaposed with how relatively simple, and I don't mean it is simple, but relatively simple it is to do urban expansion compared to urban infill in Perth, as to the market seems to just want to keep expanding.
And the pandemic accelerated that as well, and being in an apartment is still a reasonable degree of resistance to that nationally, and I don't think we can eliminate that component. But as I mentioned before, there are only two things that create demand for housing, and that is population growth and the average number of people per home. And as rents increase rapidly, and they will over the next few years, along with house prices, then the only way people can cope with that is by increasing the number of people per dwelling. And for renters, that means renting out their spare bedroom. For people that own or buying, means the same. Your work from home space will increasingly become a return to a bedroom that's being letted out. And so increasing that density will see eventually a return to higher density living, because it becomes the most affordable means of increasing dwelling stock.
Yeah, it's interesting that, I believe you.
It's coming.
Yeah, I just struggle to see it in Perth right now. It feels like we've gone backwards over the last 5 years in that push for urban living.
So the underlying component here is the damage that was done to the building industry pre-2020.
It cut deep.
It did, and lost so much capacity. Now, that was the right time to prop the industry up. It made no sense at the time to provide industry support because there wasn't the customers demanding the homes that you would have been supplying. But in retrospect, yes, holding the industry up in that 2019 cycle would have eased the pain that we're feeling now from a capacity constraint.
So just a couple of quick fire questions that I asked Michael McGowan, Executive Director in the HIA.
It's a test to see if we get the same answer.
It is. Are we building enough homes right now?
No.
Are we at capacity?
Yes, we're at capacity.
Is there a forecast that we will be able to build enough homes this decade?
No.
As an economist, what does that do to prices?
There's only one result. Prices will go up, and they will increase faster than wages and faster than CPI.
Tim Reardon, Chief Economist at the HIA, thank you very much for your time again, mate.
Anytime.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Perth Property Show. If you've only just joined the conversation, you can catch up by heading over to our website, perthpropertyshow.com.au, subscribing to the podcast, or joining our Facebook page. Don't forget to tune in next Monday at 7 a.m. for more expert insights, local analysis, and suburb spotlights. Happy hunting!